Hi, good afternoon, and a very warm welcome to everyone. Thanks for taking time out of your busy schedule to attend our webinar on the Indonesia consumption basket. My name is Yvonne Poh, and I'm part of DBS Institutional Banking Group, Industry and Relationship Team covering the food and agribusiness segment out of Singapore. I'll be your MC for today's event. Before we start, allow me to run through quickly the agenda for the day. Our country head for IBG Indonesia, Pak Kunadi, will give a short introduction to open the session. Next, for the main contents of this webinar, we have DBS research team, Andy, who will take us through the research findings. We have also allocated some time for Q&A, where Andy will be joined by his colleague from Indonesia, Menak, and our food and agribusiness industry head, Chin, who will be taking on any questions that you have. And lastly, Adrian, our industry group head, will wrap up the webinar. I'll now hand over the session to Pak Kunadi, our country head for IBG Indonesia, to kick off. Pak Kunadi is a veteran banker in the Indonesia market and plays a key role in growing our corporate banking franchise in Indonesia. Let's welcome Pak Kun. Pak Kun.
Yes, thank you, Yvonne, and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our inaugural Indonesia Food Consumption Basket webinar. Indonesia is the largest economy in Southeast Asia and is still among one of the most preferred Southeast Asian markets for investment, given its favorable demographic, being the third most populous country in Asia, and also the rising number of middle-income households and rising disposable income. But like everywhere in the world, COVID-19 has caused a slowdown in Indonesia's economy and a drop in personal income. The decision to re-implement large-scale social restriction or PSBB in Jakarta after the earlier reopening in June, due to increasing number of new cases to around 1,000 cases per day, has also negatively affected consumer sentiment. And there's currently no clarity on how long this PSBB will last. While the country has been hard hit by the pandemic and faces a negative GDP outlook for this third quarter and also next year, DBS remains optimistic in the economy in the mid to longer term, with its large domestic market, which is growing. Wealth from the middle income group is growing rapidly and is driving the economy. Indonesia is an important market for DBS and will continue to remain one of our 5 core markets in Asia, together with Singapore, India, China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. We have nearly 40 branches, 3,000 staff, and a sizable consumer, SME, and corporate banking franchise in Indonesia. DBS, along with other commentators, predicts that e-commerce will become a key trend in the post-pandemic economy. Our extensive research into Indonesia's consumption basket supports this. The theme of a young population, growing economy, and a robust consumer market enjoying digital tools is also positive for the country. During today's webinar, we will present the findings of our research and explore Indonesia's emergent consumer trends. Some of these include an increase in e-commerce, a shift in spending towards essential food items and away from non-food items, and adaptable companies looking to diversify. I hope that after today's webinar, you will gain some invaluable insights into Indonesia's shifting consumer trends and identify potential opportunities for your business. Thank you again, and I wish you all have an insightful day ahead. Thank you. Back to you, Yvonne.
Start the session proper, I'd like to bring your attention to the toggle bar at the bottom of your presentation screen. You may adjust it during the session to have a preferred proportionate view of the presentation slides and the speakers. Also, if you have any questions at any time during the presentation, please submit them via Pigeonhole at pigeonhole.at/dbswebinar. You have a QR code there to help you as well. We will address the questions during the Q&A session. Indonesia is certainly an important market in Asia, not only for DBS, but for many corporates, given its growth potential. I'm sure everyone is excited to hear more from our DBS experts on how the COVID pandemic has affected the Indonesia market. My colleague Andy Sim will be sharing with you the main content of this webinar. Andy is currently the team lead for ASEAN Consumer with DBS Research and has been a research analyst since 2006. Before joining DBS, he was with the consumer industry where he held several roles in strategic and corporate planning. Andy, over to you, please.
Thank you, Yvonne. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues. I hope you and your loved ones are keeping safe in your respective countries and cities. This COVID-19 pandemic has stretched beyond my and my colleagues' expectation, and I'm guessing that it is the same to many of you as well. When this virus first surfaced internationally in late Jan, we were using the playbook of SARS back in 2003 as a reference, thinking that the situation will normalize in 5 to 6 months. Now with 2020 hindsight, how wrong could we be, right? No one would have thought that this could literally shut the whole world down. It has now been more than 10 months since our outbreak, with almost 35 million cases and over 1 million deaths. With the situation still evolving and infection rates climbing in certain areas, I think you can ask 100 people what are their views on and when this will end, and we will get very different responses. So thank you for joining us this afternoon on this webinar as we share some insights and studies that we at DBS Group Research has done on the Indonesian consumer and how COVID-19 has and could shape behaviors going forward. In this session, we will touch on 3 main areas which we hope will be of interest to you. First, from the grassroots, behavioral trends and changes and implication from a consumer survey we conducted on Indonesia consumers. Then we will share some high-level macro consumption basket forecasts we have done before and how we expect it to change. Lastly, we also touch on what companies are saying, responding before we move on to the Q&A. Let me now start on the first section to share some findings and insights on our survey. A bit of background before we go into the more details. We conducted a survey for Indonesian residents that we received more than 500 responses over 2 weeks in the second half of June. Now, why did we choose this period? We thought that it was appropriate given that it was about 10 weeks into the lockdown, PSBB, and consumers may have slipped into an adjusted routine then. This is also to strike while the iron is hot and gain some early insights into the potential behavioral changes and also perceptions. Our survey questions cover a number of areas on health, hygiene, meals, shopping habits, and attitudes towards outside of home activities. So this slide shows the respondents' demographic background, which we feel is important to share and put things into perspective. We have about 70% respondents from Greater Jakarta, 17% from Java outside of Greater Jakarta, and the remaining from the rest of the country. In terms of age distribution, we reach a range of age profiles in the economic productive categories, as well as those with similarly higher purchasing power. The split of respondents were about 40-60 male-female ratio, and we are cognizant that this actually differs to the 99-100% ratio for the whole population itself. So in the following slides, we term our findings with the acronym 3 HATs, i.e. health hygiene, homeward focus, home cook accelerated e-commerce, and also traditional grocery. Let me move into the first H on health and hygiene. Here we focus on 2 aspects. First is on consumption, and the other is on cleanliness and hygiene. As you can see on the left-hand pie chart, more than 1 in 2, or about 54% of respondents indicated that they would consume more vitamins and supplements compared to before the pandemic. Along with the 33% who would consume the same as before, we have about 80% looking at same or more in the usage of supplements or vitamins. This indicating a very strong attitude towards health products or those which complements it. On the right-hand side, the responses are quite similar. This pertains to personal hygiene, where the question was on the expected level of personal hygiene post-COVID. As you can see, An overwhelming almost 9 in 10 would continue to pay more attention to hygiene compared to before the pandemic. Okay, what this shows is that the impact of this episode is likely to linger on and have an impact on consumers' attitudes towards hygiene factors in our view. Okay, moving on, the findings in this slide actually really surprised us. Here we look at meal consumption habits and behavior. I would like to refer you to the left-hand side of the chart again. This is in response to questions on the meal preference location and type prior to COVID. That is what respondents preferred or said they prefer previously. Here, we see about 42% of respondents, or 4 in 10, indicating preference for meals at home and 35% for eating out. Then we have about 14% respondents indicating preference for food delivery, 7% on takeaways. Now, the shift is relatively unreal, like what we mentioned in the title. What is interesting is a huge shift towards home-cooked meals at the expense of eating out. On the right-hand side, we see a jump. Almost 7 in 10 would be or are looking towards eating at home. And correspondingly, it took a humongous share from eating out, dropping to just 5%. Food delivery share saw jump to about 14% from 80%, sorry, I beg your pardon, from 14% of respondents, which I personally thought that we would see a higher share of total respondents, though from a growth perspective, this is actually also a credible 50%. Of course, in the light of this, we also have to take into account the time of survey, which was just around the time of reopening the malls and other services on 15 June. And most have been under the PSBB for about 2 months then. This may have contributed somewhat to the swing, though still worth noting. So let's move on. Next, on this slide, we surveyed on shopping preference. For this trend, I guess most of us have largely expected it given the onslaught of e-commerce and online shopping we have been exposed to. But the magnitude of shift could still surprise. As you can see again on the left-hand side, 7 in 10 or 73% had actually indicated that the most common way of shopping was at physical stores, i.e. malls, department stores, or clothes shops, shoes, and non-food items. We have about 24% preferring e-commerce, which actually seems higher than other industry reports and e-commerce penetration reports, which puts it around 5% of total retail sales. Then we have a small figure of 1% each for local businesses, social media, and company websites. So looking at the responses on the right-hand side, physical stores actually dropped by 2/3 to 24%, while e-commerce actually increased by 2.5 times to 2/3 of respondents. Social media and company website grew many-folds to 3% and 6% respectively. This is interesting actually, as we noted that some companies actually were quick to adapt and rely on alternative channels such as WhatsApp, Facebook to engage customers during the lockdown when stores were closed. Okay, the fourth factor, moving on to traditional grocery. Similar to shopping location, we also asked, what was the preferred location or way of shopping for groceries? As you can see again on the left-hand side, 1 in 2 or 52% preferred traditional markets, 4 in 10 at hypermarts and supermarkets, and only 3% preferred online grocery apps. So on the right-hand side, which is the changes, and as you can see from the arrows, traditional markets saw the figures drop to 30%, while online grocery increased by 7-folds to 21%. Supermarkets and hypermarkets stayed actually similar at 44%. Of course, again, this number also must be taken into context that traditional markets were closed temporarily. However, our take is that there have been trials by consumers to use online grocery shopping, driven by the circumstances, and this pandemic may have accelerated the shift, as the responses suggest. So moving on to our last H, home is now the new outdoors, as we term it. Here we wanted to find out the perspective of staying home, going out for leisure, etc. post-COVID. On the left-hand side, it was on choosing between working, studying at home. Here we asked, post-COVID, when the situation eases, will you prefer to work or study from home? It seems that the respondents does prefer some flexibility with around 50% and the majority preferring a balance. Actually, what is more interesting is actually on the perspective of going out for leisure, right? It seems that an overwhelming majority, or 7 in 10, 70%, 72%, say they are likely to go out less. So a quarter or 25% indicated same as before, meaning that life will be back to usual for this group. And just a minority or 3% would go out more often. So this is actually a key towards consumer perspective of home, and looks like more are willing to have their leisure and work life evolving around their respective homes. Lastly, on this section, I just want to touch on consumer sentiment and perspective of spending. As you can see, there seems to be an overwhelming majority seeking to save up. We think that this is likely brought upon by the uncertainty of this COVID situation. Even at this moment, we are still uncertain on how long this will drag. But what is important is that consumers in Indonesia, or at least what the respondents are saying, is that they are likely to be more careful on spending, at least in the near term, till there is greater clarity. So I could bet that, if we were to send out this survey again, we could even have a higher skew towards this, given, how long this actually has dragged. So if I could quickly summarize, this chart puts together our key findings, and in the interest of time, on the next, in the interest of time, I will actually not touch on it again. This is also in our report. Right. So moving on this chart, on the implication of businesses, we briefly touch on the key implications for businesses. These are not exhaustive and applies to different businesses on different aspects. Say for health and hygiene, packaged food could see more interest in products that promote wellness, health. Ready to cook, ready to eat meals, seasoning sauces are key. And on the home cook side, how to make consumers be home chef, if I can term it, making it easy and entertaining in the midst of it. So, and for food services, a focus will be on clean and safe premises, packaging and delivery, if any. And probably we also have to think about delivery channels, menu revamp suited for takeaways, locations, etc. And lastly, most importantly, also for all businesses, sales channel is actually very important. If one has been focused on a single channel, a rethink may be a long time coming, as a result of this episode. So allow me to move on to the second section of our today's presentation, which is on macro consumption basket. Right. Setting the backdrop here, we did a study last year and published an in-depth report on Indonesian consumption basket, looking at the past 10 years and how we expect to change going forward. We actually did this study analyzing about 100,000 data points across the country and its over 30 provinces, rural and urban, looking at spending on different categories, food, non-food, and within food, rice, meat, eggs, vegetables, and also within non-food, housing, clothing, taxes, etc., etc. Right. In general, the chart on the left shows the spending shift towards non-food in the last decade as income grows. So, and we expect this to continue in 2030, drawing patterns and data from other developing countries. In this case, we use data from other countries in Southeast Asia at the times that are similar to Indonesia's GDP per capita at current point in time. So on the right-hand side, we have our projected market sizes of different basket spending by 2030. You can see that amongst the largest spending categories will be on household, as well as prepared food and beverages. So for information, prepared food and beverages is actually a big category here. It includes eating out, packaged food, packaged drinks, snacks, chips, bread, ice cream, etc. Right, a snapshot on Indonesia, on the spending. This slide shows the general trend of various categories. We have done some consolidation for ease of representation. But worth highlighting here is that our expectations that prepared food and beverages is projected to continue its upward move. And by 2030, we expect it to be almost about 20% of consumption basket, up from 17% today. I won't go into details on this. There's a lot more details, and if you are keen, please approach us or your RMs actually for a copy of our report that was published. So, how has COVID changed our forecast? First off, if you look at the next chart, this is actually largely driven by GDP expectations, right? The chart here, looking at the GDP chart, right? Our econs team actually expects it to contract by 1% in 2020 against a trend of about 5 to 6% handle in the past decade. Thereafter, we are expecting a gradual recovery to 3.5% and 5% growth in 2021 and 22 respectively. Correspondingly, we expect to see lower personal consumption expenditure, as seen in the chart on the right-hand side, dipping marginally in 2020 before showing a gradual recovery thereafter in 2021 and beyond. Okay, moving on to slide 24. For consumer behavior, in the instance of economic contraction and uncertainty, there's actually a flight to safety. And spending basket pivot towards staple products. This actually can be seen in the financial crisis back in 2008 and 2009. So we expect spending on food categories to break the trend we have seen in the past decade of lower percentage spending and instead increase to just above 50% in 2020 from 49% we saw in 2019. So conversely, for non-food, spending on this to decline as a percentage of total. But then thereafter, we actually expect the trend we see in the past to continue. But within each broad category of food and non-food, we also like to highlight that there are variations within each category given the makeup of each. I will briefly touch on it in a slide later. Right, in this slide, we show the projected values of total consumption expenditure. Both food and non-food are expected to track lower versus our earlier forecasts. What we have here is that we expect food expenditure to grow by 2% this year versus the 5% we penciled in earlier, while non-food expenditure to dip marginally versus 6% we projected earlier. So as mentioned earlier, there are various subcategories between food and non-food. You can see about 20 categories here, which we have summarized. In fact, based on the actual statistics, there are actually close to about 100 sub-product categories. Right. This chart shows the movement we expect in the various baskets. So within the foods basket, we expect to see staple products such as cereals or rice, beans, animal protein to increase, while for prepared food and beverages, this is likely to come off this year, mainly driven by lesser eating out, mitigated by packaged food. Also for cigarettes itself, this is likely to be impacted slightly, taking into account the higher excise implemented earlier at the start of the year. So on the other hand, for non-food categories, we expect to see housing and household facility spending percentage increase at the expense of others, such as goods and services, parties and ceremonies, and leisure activities. Okay, so this brings us to the last segment of my sharing session today, which is a summary of some of our conversations with companies. In those, actually we touched on areas such as expectations at the beginning of the year, how COVID has impacted, what was done, and expectations thereafter, among others. So we summarized a few key areas for sharing in the following few slides. The first consideration for most will be on top line growth. Here, we touch on where the company's expectations for 2020 were at the beginning of the year. We did not show it here, but the companies we spoke to were originally projecting a growth in top line for 2020 versus 2019. But as you can see, this figure dropped to 40%, who still expect revenue growth in 2020 versus 19, while majority were more guarded, about 60%, either indicating flat, lower, or uncertain. In fact, on further probing, those who were actually expecting growth also expected a lower figure. Right. So on the right-hand side, there's a high level of uncertainty on the pace of recovery. This is quite related to earlier part on the revenue question. So 6 in 10 were uncertain when its operating performance will revert to pre-COVID, if it ever will be. Amongst the reasons cited were that there were actually no clarity on how this will unfold and how long this will last. Okay, note that this was actually done in July, about 2 to 3 months back. So as of today, it seems that there is still not much clarity, like what Pak Kun mentioned earlier in his introduction. Right. So on the cost side, it seems that with a clear impact on sales, it was intuitive for us to focus on costs. This is actually quite evenly mixed, as we can see on the left-hand chart. The feedback was that there was actually no significant increase in costs, and a large part of the increase actually came from COVID-related, such as additional measures on cleaning, hygiene, and some parts on logistics. On logistics side, this was largely temporary at the onset of the lockdown, and we understand that this actually has since subsided. The obvious target was A&P, and given the cream demand, majority indicated that actually they spend less than previously planned. And on the back of this, most companies actually indicated that they switched to online or digital marketing. So looking at the area of investment and capex, we compared investment plans by companies. What we see is that there is a fair bit of change in terms of investment with the outbreak of COVID. As of start of year, 70% of companies were actually expecting to spend at least the same amount as 2019, and 20% were looking at higher investment. So the COVID actually has changed the outlook on capex totally. 80% now expect to cut back on less essential capex and spend only on maintenance, preferring to shore up their capital. We think that this probably stems from past experience in GFC and AFC seen by majority of companies that we spoke to. So bringing us to the last slide, we asked how the COVID situation has led management to rethink the business strategy. This was actually an open-ended question. So what is interesting is that the word diversification came up. So in terms of sales channel, geographical, product, I guess this pandemic actually has thrown up numerous possibilities and situations which were previously unseen. So depending on each company's situation, sales channel diversification pertains to expanding online and B2C, the mention of third-party platforms and using online platforms as well. So many mentions were on geography, be it internally within Indonesia or looking for new markets for export. I think actually this is very interesting, as our conversations with companies previously were largely focused on growing domestically. So there seems to be more interest in looking out internationally amongst the companies that we spoke to. So with that, this brings me to the end of my sharing session. We try to keep it short and concise, but still hope it has been very useful, particularly the different aspects touching on the consumer behavior, leading to macro assumption, and back down to company level responses. We also want to highlight that actually this is actually not an end-all topic. As per all our work previously, we welcome feedback from you, and conversations to explore further or go further into details. So once again, thank you. And I'll hand back to my colleague Yvonne. Thank you. Yvonne, over to you, please.
Thank you, Andy, for the insightful sharing. I'm sure you have some questions after his presentation. Please send in your questions via the Pigeonhole portal. You can do it easily by just scanning the QR code to get into the Pigeonhole. Now I'll just do a quick introduction of the panelists for the Q&A session. Besides Andy, we have also my colleague, Mr. Chin Yok Pao, who is part of our institutional banking group, heading the food and agribusiness industry team. Chin leads a team of industry and relationship managers covering the food and agribusiness portfolio in Singapore, and also drives the F&A strategy globally with our country teams on the ground. Besides Chin, we also have my colleague Menak from our group research team in a panelist. Menak has been leading the Indonesia research team for the past 10 years and has over 15 years of experience in equity research. Let's now maybe look at the list of questions. Okay, we can start perhaps with something on e-commerce. Okay, e-commerce adoption has certainly grown exponentially in Indonesia due to COVID-19. How do we see local F&B companies transforming with this change? Menak, since you are our Indonesian expert, could you take on this question, please?
Sure. Thank you, Yvonne. COVID-19 definitely has accelerated the adoption of e-commerce as well as digitalization in Indonesia. It's evident that in the second quarter, the gross merchandise value or GMV for Indonesia e-commerce surpassed India according to Redseer. And it is also expected that the GMV will nearly double in 2020 versus 2019. So the e-commerce trend is definitely there. We have seen local F&B companies capitalizing on the opportunity for e-commerce in Indonesia. I think there are many ways local F&B companies are adopting e-commerce, but for the most part, it is for channel expansion, given the landscape of the country, and so they are using e-commerce as a way to reach more consumers. I think logistic and fulfillment are definitely one of the key challenges for e-commerce adoption in Indonesia. Depending on where the companies are in the value chain, I think each company has a different strategy to tackle these issues, and also different strategies in terms of the e-commerce or digitalization. For example, some companies, because of COVID-19, may shift more toward partnering with the aggregator or the e-commerce platform, but some decided to use their website or create their own apps to deal with this e-commerce adoption in Indonesia. But I think in general, one thing to note though, that for Indonesia market in the near term, I think F&B companies still cannot ignore the traditional or the modern channel, despite the growth of e-commerce, because I think the relative penetration of e-commerce is still low, because also of the rural and urban mix in Indonesia.
Thanks, Mina, for the sharing. Chin, based on your regional coverage in the F&B segment, do you see a similar trend of acceleration in e-commerce outside Indonesia during this period? And how are some of our customers coping as well?
We have seen similar trend outside Indonesia in Asia. Basically, I think COVID has been a major catalyst for the shift towards e-commerce due to partial or total lockdown of physical outlets, physical stores due to COVID. E-commerce has become the sole channel. At the peak, we have even seen grocery companies frantically adding capacity around in the region to fulfill orders online. And as we all know, grocery has been the least penetrated in terms of the consumer online market. I think the real question is, how sticky will the shift to e-commerce be? I believe that in the region, the trend or the shift towards e-commerce will endure to some extent. Why? The reason being, firstly, we have seen older generation becoming newly comfortable with digital channels. And secondly, there are also new consumer segments who have never tried e-commerce at all and have overcome the barrier to trial. At least they've set up an account and they start to use that to order their food online or their goods online. And thirdly, in the medium term, as was mentioned earlier on, there's no clarity at this moment when will COVID basically pass us by. So therefore, I think the medium term, we will see that people may prefer a safer experience of shopping online compared to the prospect of shopping in very crowded stores.
Thanks, Shin. Certainly, I think while the e-commerce adoption rate, is increasing very fast, the adoption rate differs from country to country, depending on the demographics as well as the rural and urban divide. But this trend, I think, is something that no one can ignore. Let's move on to the next question. Okay, there is one on health and hygiene. Let me quickly put that on. Health and hygiene are top of consumers' mind, and consumers are likely to pay more attention to healthy products in the near future. How do you see the shift towards healthy food and premiumization in the longer term? Andy, could you share your thoughts on this, please?
Thanks, Yvonne. Sure. Okay, this is actually a easy and difficult question. Easy because longer term, if you're talking about longer term trend, I may not be around to live up to it or answer it. But difficult because actually the situation is actually quite fluid. Okay, so but to put it in a nutshell, healthy food actually is already a trend and writing on the wall. You know, you look at across the region or in the world, like for instance, less sugar, nutritional information. People are counting calories, especially with the prevalence of social media amongst the younger generation. Right, it's catching on very fast. So what this episode will happen is actually may nudge consumers more in that direction. So whether it lasts or not, you know, still early days, but my guess is it's still trending towards there. Near term, we will see focus on, you know, like more healthy drinks, vitamin drinks, health food. I guess the key for business is actually on to latch on the trend, you know, and try to, you know, grow, see any products that actually you can grow it or latch on it. But also, like what Park Maynard said, right? We need to caution in the context of Indonesia. Also, in this context, we need to remember about the income divide. So there's actually a huge gap between rural and urban. So spending between rural and urban is about 1.6 to 1, meaning every dollar that a rural consumer spend, urban consumer spend 1.6 times more. So pricing and costs, you know, will be key feature. You know, we also have to be aware, you know, of the so-called the health paradox, meaning how much consumers are actually willing to pay for healthy products, right? This is actually a consideration we actually have to take into account as well. Yep. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. I think that's very insightful. Going back to maybe one question on e-commerce. This is about more how, hang on, yeah. Okay. How will the trade war and the US elections affect the e-commerce in Asia? Chin and Andy, would you like to take this?
Okay, maybe I can go first.
Sure.
I think, yeah. So I think this will probably be actually positive for actually maybe not Asia, but maybe for Southeast Asia, right? If you can see actually since our trend in Indonesia, in DBS last year, we're actually calling because of the trade war last year that's happening. We're actually seeing a shift towards Southeast Asia, and this is actually a positive, you know, and benefiting for it. In fact, in Southeast Asia, since last year we have seen Vietnam, you know, coming on, you know, and so Southeast Asia is probably seen as the so-called a neutral party to it, and it becomes like a beneficiary of it, if I can add. With respect to the US election, I think it's anybody's guess, you know, it's 50-50 whether Joe Biden or Trump wins, you know. But I guess whether either party wins, it seems that both are actually saying that, you know, they will still continue the pressure on China, and which means the trade war will still be a very high tension, which means Southeast Asia would likely be actually a beneficiary of it. So I don't know whether Chin has anything else to add.
Yeah, I think there will be a paradigm shift in terms of supply chain given the ongoing geopolitical issue between China and US. We will see some shift, away from China to Southeast Asia. But I think what will be interesting is probably we will see an increased focus on domestic food security and even domestic food supply chain. So I think what we probably will see is that going forward, companies or distribution companies probably have to be more agile in their planning to ensure that the supply chain will be resilient, more resilient. So they probably have to plan for a just in case, for resilience instead of the currently a just in time model on the cost efficient model.
Okay, thanks, Chin. I'm a bit cautious of time. So with this, maybe we will just take the last two questions. Okay, there's one question on the different segment. Okay, so with the shift of consumer purchases towards food staples during COVID-19, how is consumer spending expected to change and the impact on the different sub-segments within the food and beverage industry? Pak Mena, do you want to take this?
Yes, Yvonne. I think in the context of Indonesia consumer, while we don't know what exactly gonna happen post-COVID in terms of consumer behavior, but we believe that there is gonna be a shift back or shift away from food staples to other items once COVID-19 is over and life goes back to normal. So the timing is obviously difficult. We don't know whether it is next year, middle of next year, early next year, or end of this year. But once the reopening happens and one traveling can resume, I think the food services industry should definitely see a pickup. We believe that people are forced to eat at home now because of the lockdown and because of the COVID-19. But once it's over, I think people will start to eat out again. And then once traveling can resume, we also expect restaurants, hotels, and cafe also to recover again. So the pattern definitely will change. And then in the long term, based on the research that has been done by my colleague Andy and the team, we also expect that the rising income, once the economy recovers, also will increase spending towards non-food items, as well as maybe toward more, food services and packaged food items as well. Perhaps Andy or Chin, you want to add on this?
No, I think you have pretty much covered quite well on that.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks, Mena. Okay, so one last question. Now, this is more about the channels, the distribution channels. There are shifts from the traditional markets to online purchases and modern grocery retailers due to lockdown and social distancing. Will this trend continue? How are companies rethinking their distribution strategy? Chin and Mena, I'll be happy to hear your views on this. Chin, maybe you want to start to address this first?
Sure, Yvonne. I think it is a fact that during COVID, right, that there is a big adoption and shift on online orders purely because there are no other choice, right? Because of the lockdown, partial or even total closure of physical stores, right? Having said that, right, we do have seen during also a COVID, because of safety, we have seen an increased consumption of even basic food staple in consumer retail pack. We are talking about basic food staple like rice, flour, sugar, besides Indonesia, in India and even Philippines too. So therefore, I think with this shift in adoption or consumption of food staple in consumer retail pack compared to the traditional loose form, because they can only order online, I think that is going to be a catalyst, right, for a shift from the traditional market to the modern grocery retail side. But having said that, I think we always have to recognize that in different countries there are different so-called cycle of development in terms of the distribution and the channels of sales. And therefore, I think for most companies, depending on which country they are in, they have to adopt a omni-channel, a multiple channel, and depending on, and so that they can target the different customer segments and the different target market for growth. Even in larger countries like Indonesia, Philippines, and India, potentially we also seeing a higher growth in, I would call, the neighborhood proximity format, like convenience stores or mini mart, because that gave you the bigger reach to the last mile, especially in the more rural area.
Thanks, Shin. Meena, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think just to add to what Chin just mentioned earlier, in the context of Indonesia, I think that if we look at what is happening in the past several years, basically the large store format has been declining, and the growth has been filled more by the convenience store. I think the infrastructure development that the Indonesian government is doing is going to probably push more urbanization, which means the modern grocery or the convenience store penetration could improve or could increase, supported by the infrastructure and the logistics. I think online is something that we need to see, obviously supported by demographics as well as technology. But I think the adoption of online purchases, I think is something that we probably still kind of like in the early stage, and whether Indonesia can reach the level like China remains to be seen, especially the logistic and the landscape of Indonesia is different than a country like China.
Okay, thanks everyone, for sharing from your vast experience. We are running short of time. I really need to close this Q&A session. As what Andy mentioned, right? This is not the end. So if you have any other questions, do reach out to your relationship manager. I'll now just go on to the closing remarks by Adrian. Adrian is actually our Managing Director, Industry Head, covering several key industries, including food and agribusiness, automotives, consumer products and services, healthcare and pharmaceutical, and metals and mining. He will end the session with a closing remarks. Before this role as Industry Head, Adrian was the Head of Institutional Banking Group China, leading the transformation of the business into a diversified commercial and investment banking franchise with a strong regional connectivity, and elevating DBS to be one of the top bond houses with China issuers in the offshore market as well. Adrian, over to you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Firstly, thank you for joining us today. I trust that this has been an insightful and timely discussion into the pandemic's significant impact on consumer trends in Southeast Asia's largest economy. As our extensive research into Indonesia's consumption found, the agility to adapt to the new norm has grown in importance with a sense of urgency too. Right? During the pandemic, business reinvention, digital adoption, and sustainability objectives have accelerated, exceeding even our most aggressive forecasts. Now at DBS, we take digital transformation seriously. We have worked extensively with clients during this time and are proud to have partners with leading companies in the region to drive forward their business diversification and digital transformation with our suite of market-leading and sustainable solutions. Now, to this end, we have received extremely positive feedback from customers that our holistic and practical solutions have enabled them to provide better service to their customers. Some of these examples would include, firstly, we implemented a digital solution for Indomaret using our DBS Rapid Cash solution, which enabled Indomaret to conduct bank account verification instantly. And this helped Indomaret to expand its service offerings to its customer by offering credit card bill services via its iSaku e-wallet platform. Now Indomaret captures more transactions for its e-platform business. Secondly, we also work with one of Indonesia's leading integrated aquaculture player to provide API solutions for their LC issuance and trade loan drawdown. With the ability to have a straight-through processing between the company's ERP system and DBS system, the company can enjoy faster LC issuance and drawdown with no manual intervention. We are also in the process of setting up the Rapid Cash in order to improve their cash management experience with us. It will help to enable customers to have an instant account verification, to reduce transfer rejection due to wrong account number, inward credit confirmation through API, as well as provide instant information on balance, activities, and queries of the remittance transfer. We are also very active in ESG-linked transactions in food and agribusiness industry segment and have put in 3 sustainability-linked loans for 3 large agribusiness companies, namely Wilmar, Louis Dreyfus, and Olam. DBS has recently been awarded World Best Bank by New York-based financial publication Global Finance, marking the 3rd consecutive year. Accolades like this speak of your continued support and partnership that inspire us to reach new heights and have driven us to become a globally recognized leader in digital banking. Your success is our success, and it is in these uncertain times when we want to support you. I'm confident that through the insights gained at today's webinar, you will discover even more opportunities to rethink and adapt your business strategies to the new norm. And we are here to work with you through the journey to make it a success. Now, on behalf of DBS, thank you again for your continued trust and support. We are truly grateful to partner you in your financial journey, and thank you again for joining us today. Thank you.
Thanks, Adrian, for the closing. We appreciate everybody's participation in this webinar and hope it has been an insightful one for you. Like I say, your relationship managers will be following up with you to discuss this topic further and explore how we can help you in your business transformation during these challenging times. Once again, thank you, everyone. See you soon. Stay safe.